Hi everyone, welcome to today's lecture on 19th century landscape painting and national identity in the United States. This will be a lecture that's fundamental to your writing assignment coming up, so take good notes, I suppose. It's also a really, I think, interesting topic because what we're talking about here in the 19th century, as we started to go into the last two lectures, are art forms that at some level are helping to foster ideas about national identity, right? They are, on the one hand, a kind of reflection of prevalent ideological positions that were taken in the 19th century, big governing beliefs, in other words. And those governing beliefs, of course, are at the basis of what becomes our national sense of self, right? Early on as a nation, we had to decide what are we not, where are we going, what do we want this country to be? And so really I'm trying to think about and have you think about landscape paintings in relation to these prevalent views in the world of the time that they were produced and how these in turn helped. On the one hand, they reflect, but on the other hand, perpetuate or engender or foster ideas of national identity. So to start us off, let me just remind you, when we first started talking about nationalism and art in the United States, we were talking primarily about the grand manner style. And the argument that I made, and it's kind of the standard argument, is that there were a ton of artists or wannabe artists who, with very good will, went to Europe to train, and then they came back to the United States hoping to import that style and art, kind of high art in general, to the United States. They really saw themselves to some degree as public servants and other degrees as entrepreneurs and so forth. The problem was that they tried to import a style that didn't really fit with what people thought of as an American art style. They were importing a style that over and again was criticized for being elitist, for being too European, for being something that Americans wouldn't support. So I remind us of this by bringing in this painting by Charles Bird King, this Poor Artist Cupboard. Remember, he's one of many artists who went to Europe, came back, didn't have much luck with the grand manner style, so he's trying to show how America doesn't support artists. Now, as we went into last week, he found another subject that Americans would support, the representation of Native American peoples. And what I was trying to argue last week, and it dovetails with what I'm talking about today, is that our representations of Native Americans in the 19th century probably say a lot more about white culture than it does about Native American culture, and that there was a process of othering involved in those representations. Because when we talk about identity, whether it be personal identity or national identity, any kind of identity, we're really talking about a definition. And definitions, as I argued last week, unfold on binaries, where you say this is what we are and this is what we're not. And aspects of Native American life, particularly their savage nature, was something that was opposed to white civilized culture. So then another place, though, that nationalism shows up, if we want to just use that as a very broad term, right? Senses of what we are collectively as a nation, what we value, what we don't value, and so forth, is in landscape painting. And frankly, landscape painting of the 19th century, for most of us art historians, is the first truly successful painting form in the United States. It may be the very first successful art form, besides, of course, portraiture. I mean, this is something a little bit beyond just portraiture, I suppose. And so before even talking about some of these landscape paintings and going into some examples, what I want to do is talk about a number of ideas, all of which, by the way, are interrelated. These aren't mutually exclusive by any means. But, for the purposes of teaching and getting some of these ideas introduced to us, I thought I'd break them up into parts here. So on the screen in front of you, you should see these kind of 5 terms. Again, all very interrelated. And I want you to have these terms, again, before we start talking about the landscape, just to give us an introduction. And the first thing I want to say is that, number one, the pristine landscape, by which when someone says pristine landscape, we mean something that's basically untouched or relatively untouched, something that hasn't been turned into a garden or into a cultivated field or something like that. It's just boundless, endless, pristine landscape. Well, that was something that we had, that Europeans, which are, on the one hand, Europeans to us are where we come from. There is a sense of collective identity, especially with Great Britain, particularly England. But on the other hand, they're a little bit of our rivals. After all, people left Europe for reasons to distance themselves, but still wanted to have this kind of cultural affiliation to some degree. In any case, if you think about Europe, which is in the midst of the Industrial Revolution at this time, where civilization has, really progressed and advanced and gotten quite complicated and dense in various areas, there isn't a lot of area, especially in Great Britain, that is, particularly unblemished, pristine landscape. There have been long histories of, cultivating the land, using up many of the natural resources and so forth. So, when people were coming to North America, they were coming to this kind of wilderness, right? Something that was untamed. And on the one hand, that was something that could be a little dangerous. And on the other hand, it had a whole host of other associations with it that we're going to go into. In fact, I want people who were born in the United States and have some kind of deep understanding of this, and I don't mean nationalists, I mean people who really are familiar with the long history of the United States, to just stop and think a moment about how often the landscape or nature shows up in some type of art form or literature or, for instance, songs that are associated with our national identity. An obvious one, for instance, just to point to one of many, is, America the Beautiful. That famous song, so nationalistic, is just filled with imagery that comes from nature. Our first major literary figures, people like James Fenimore Cooper, is forever talking about scenes set in the landscape and setting up these masterful types of adventures, all of which take place in the land. You think of our first major poetry, William Cullen Bryant will show up today. Or you think of, for instance, our first major philosophy, Transcendentalism. All of these things and many, many others are going to invoke the idea of nature as something that is particular to the United States. Now, it's not, of course, but that's a big idea, and it's still around today. So that's really what we're getting at. So let's go on to number 2, a little bit more complicated concept. And again, these things are all interlinked. But in the 19th century, and not just in the United States, also if you have taken classes on German arts, you'll know that this is very common in the Germanic world, including into the Scandinavian countries, and is an offshoot of Christian mysticism. In the United States, there is a lot of talk and a lot of belief in what is generally known as pantheism. Now, pantheism is, in this instance, not the belief in all gods. That's another association with this term. It is instead the belief that God is part and parcel of nature. Or another way to put this is to say that Christian mystics believe that God made the universe out of something, and that something was like his divine energy. And so God existed in all things of his creation, in us, in nature, particularly things that were, again, not touched by civilization. Now stop and think about this for a minute. And by the way, if you've come across this term before and it was announced to you as being deism or deism, that's the same kind of term. Pantheism is particularly American, it's particularly associated with nature. But deism is the belief that God or some divine energy exists in all things. And it's very common. For instance, why am I blanking on his name? I'm trying to think of Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, that's who I'm thinking of, was a deist, for instance. Associationalism is another term for a particular kind of pantheism that we'll see being associated with Thomas Cole in a minute. But in any case, think about the implications of this and what this means. And again, pantheism was a part not just of people's religious beliefs, even though it was something that you can find in a million sermons of the time. Look up Cotton Mather, for instance. He's talking about things that are clearly pantheistic all of the time. You can find it in philosophy of the time. I made mention of the Transcendentalists. You know, of course, of, I think, Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the major Transcendentalists. And let me just read you a little passage of what he said in his famous text called Nature from 1836. And it's a part of your reading, by the way. He said, quote, "In the woods is perpetual youth. Within these plantations of God a decorum and sanctity reign, a perennial festival is dressed. In the woods we return to reason and faith. There I feel that nothing can befall me, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egoism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part and particle of God." Now, that sounds straightforward religious, and of course, in a way, it is. Those of you who've heard ideas like this before, particularly in Eastern philosophies or Eastern religions, that's probably where Ralph Waldo Emerson was getting some of these ideas. What he's getting at is the idea that if God is part and parcel of nature and he's all around us in pristine nature, that is a kind of moralizing force. It's something that is going to rectify our worst tendencies and point us in the correct direction. Now, of course, it's not just religious leaders. It's not just the transcendentalists. You can think of course, Thoreau also talking about the way that nature centers him and so forth. It's also in political speeches. It's a part of the belief system of just everyday people as well. Now, related to pantheism is another complex term that we need to talk about here because, in a sense, the sublime is the way that a painter or a visual artist will try to manifest the idea of pantheism, or one way that they will. The sublime, not to be messed up with the way that we talk about the sublime today, where, ice cream can be sublime. In the 19th century, and actually these ideas start in the 18th century, relate to philosophical beliefs. First, of Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke once said that the sublime was it's this feeling that one has in front of something that is awesome. And by awesome, what they mean is awe-inspiring. And if you think of awe is something that on the one hand is exhilarating. It's quite powerful in its exhilaration, so it can be exciting, but it's also terrifying as well. Generally speaking, when Edmund Burke was talking about the sublime, he was trying to get to this mix of emotions that on the one hand are quite exhilarating and empowering and make us feel alive and excited and full of energy. And on the other hand, a feeling that minimized us, made us feel small and weak and powerless or ineffectual, something that showed our vulnerability. So it is at its basis of almost ambivalent type of feeling, right? You have these two almost conflicting emotional feelings at once. But I want to complicate this a little bit and hopefully explain it a little bit better, because another philosopher expounded the idea of the sublime in a way that I think makes it more meaningful in relation to how it is associated with pantheism. That philosopher was Immanuel Kant, the famous German Romantic philosopher. Now, Kant once said, and for those of you who don't know, Kant's main goal in many of his philosophical works was to try to explain, in a very kind of modernist way, the limits of various forms of inquiry. So, for instance, in the Critique of Pure Judgment, Kant tried to show through philosophy how far philosophy could actually go in asking and answering questions, and set limits on philosophical exploration when they came to things like the explanation of what God is, or why did God exist, or, is there a God? And Kant basically said you can't ask those questions because philosophy has no way to answer them. They're matters of faith. In any case, Kant then, for instance, dealing with universal types of ideas that had been claimed by philosophy forever to have a kind of universal, timeless, transcendent basis, like what we were talking about when we were talking about the Graham Manor style in relation to Platonic and Neoplatonic ideas, and beauty itself being a rational idea. Well, Kant came and said, you know what? There is no such thing as beauty with a capital B that's universal and timeless for all people in all times in all places, really. What there is a kind of beauty, and this is his argument, there's a kind of beauty that exists in the world that is completely subjective. But it's subjective in a sense that it takes place within us, but we all share this emotional response to various stimuli. Or a better way to put this, just back up here and say it again. Kant said, there's no such thing as beauty, like Plato would say, existing in the realm of forms, or beauty in the sense of something that is beyond our sensate abilities, that's just completely rational. What he said was that beauty is actually the feeling that we get when our minds, which are structured in a very particular way, ordered in a very particular way, are searching for something in the world and find something in the world around it that corresponds to that basic order of our minds. And when we find that order in the world, we label that order the beautiful, right? So another way to put this is to say, for Kant, for instance, and it's not exactly perfect, but we have all these studies these days, one of which is we hook up little nodes to infants' heads to try to figure out what's going on, where their brain is being stimulated by various sensory inputs. And we have found over and over again that particular orders of musical sounds and progressions will light up the pleasure centers of young infants. Now think of this. This is like Kant saying your mind's set up in a particular way so as to respond to something, some stimulus out there in the world that has a particular order as pleasure, and then we name that the beautiful, right? It's something like that. Now, you're probably wondering, what the hell does this have to do with the sublime, right? Well, here's the next thing for Kant. The sublime is the experience of a kind of order, or I just want to say order or truth that exists beyond human capability to apprehend it. Another way to put this is, if you've ever had those moments in time where you've just caught a glimpse or a glance of some answer, but you can't really put it into words and you can't really quite apprehend it or comprehend it, that's the feeling of the sublime that Kant wanted to point towards. It's, for instance, you might think, well, there must be some rational explanation for how space unfolds, right? Does space go on forever? What's at the end of space? Or time? When did time start and stop? These big, huge questions. Kant said, well, you can't answer those. There must be some kind of answer, but our human capabilities to answer those questions pale next to the magnitude of the order or truth that must be in existence in those questions. And when you glimpse those things, and on the one hand, again, this is exhilarating because you think, I almost have this big question. And then on the other hand, you aren't ever going to get there. There's that ambivalent, conflicting feelings again, right? On the one hand, exhilaration for almost recognizing some kind of universal, huge order that exists in the universe. And on the other hand, a recognition of how puny and small and ineffectual as humans we really are. Now let me link that with pantheism. If you're a Christian and you believe that your God is universal, timeless, all-knowing, omniscient, and so forth, and you believe that this God created you and he created this world, you're going to tend to believe that that God has a plan, aren't you? That he has some kind of reason or rationality or some kind of order or truth that must exist in this world and us, even if we can't glimpse it. So that when you catch that glimpse of something that is of vast magnitude, or something that is incredibly complex, or something that's all-powerful, that is a glimpse of the sublime that then points to the existence of God in the world around us. Now, I've made this really complicated because I think the ideas deserve to be talked about in complicated terms. But honestly, big markers of the sublime in landscape painting are things that are vast. So vast sky, right? Some kind of indication of the longevity of historical time is an indication of the sublime and of pantheism or God in nature. So for instance, you think, for instance, we as human beings live, if we're lucky, really lucky, 100 years. And think of historical time that goes on for billions of years. How do those two things go together? If an artist shows you ruins, for instance, from an age that existed 1,000 years ago or more, that might be an indication of the sublime. Big, powerful storms coming in, the endless sea, things that are unexplainable and powerful will be indicators of the sublime. Now we get to 4 and 5, manifest destiny and progress, which are fairly closely related. We talked about manifest destiny last time, right? This belief, it's a term that's coined in the middle of the 19th century, but the ideas have been around for a while, that it is the right and the duty of U.S. citizens, whites, to go forth and to settle and to make use of the natural resources that we find in this pristine landscape, right? It's our manifest destiny. That's what God wants from us. That's his divine will. He wants us to make use of this land. He wants us to put it to use. And this is where, again, other significances of the landscape show up. And if you're starting to see how these conflict to a degree, you're going to see that same conflict in landscape painting. So if on the one hand you're a pantheist and you believe that all pristine nature is a manifestation of the divine, then how does it make sense that you're supposed to go, let's say, chop down a ton of trees and, mine for gold or any number of things that will get rid of that pristine landscape, build huge factories, pull oil out of the ground, do things that will blemish that landscape? Well, people in the 19th century didn't really see these things in so much conflict, or when they did, a few times, like Thomas Cole's work that you'll see in a moment, they'll talk about it. What they tended to believe was the idea that God is kind of giving us part of himself, that God has provided us with this world and all of its endless natural resources that can be converted into progress, meaning it's like the fuel that will fuel our progress, fuel our growth, fuel our wealth, fuel our technological innovations. He's given us all of this. He wants us to put it to use. And that's a very common idea, not just in the United States, but all over the world in the West at this time. So, manifest destiny, which really is pointing towards go out west, make use of the things you find there, both in terms of your own personal life. For instance, I'll give you land, go cut down some trees, build yourself a house, farm the land to subsist and so forth. Or as a nation, go out there, exploit the landscape so as to, again, sell timber off to Europe, or fish off to Europe, or pelts off to Europe, and so forth. So it's very closely associated, again, with this idea of progress that we saw before, which is, of course, if you're a very young nation, something that is the fundamental watchword of the 19th century. We start small, but progress is something that is fundamental to our destiny. Okay, I'm going to pause here, and then I'll come back with a landscape painting in a second. Okay, so let's look at some paintings, shall we? And talk about where these ideas show up. The first of the major painters that we're going to be covering is Thomas Cole. Thomas Cole was actually born in England, grew up amidst the Industrial Revolution. He was a pantheist, but his form of pantheism is something that is known by the term associationalism. It's just a particular Scottish form of pantheism. He had a little bit of training in Europe, and then after he came to the United States in his teens, after he began painting for a while, he actually took his requisite trip back to Europe, to Italy, to look at, the classical arts, and he wasn't much impressed. Most of the works of art that he painted, such as this one called the Catterskill Falls, were scenes that he saw or imagined in the area of the Hudson River. So you think of areas around contemporary New York and into New England at the time. And he is sometimes known as the founder of the Hudson River School. You'll notice I didn't put the Hudson River School as a term on your lecture guides. There's a reason for this. It tends to confuse people, frankly. It's not a school at all. These are painters that were painting in roughly the same areas of the same thing, landscape painting, and some of them hated each other, didn't hang out at all, yet historians, for various reasons I'm not going to get into, decided to label them a school, a group of painters sharing the same subject in the same locale, but they're not actually in the same school. In any case, back to the major point, which is the vast majority of Thomas Cole's paintings are scenes like this that are just beautiful, beautiful scenes of this part of the world. And why is he painting something like the Catterskill Falls? Well, it's a little like those of you who are from the Northwest and have visited Snoqualmie Falls. Waterfalls are beautiful, right? And here you've got that beautiful falls set in this beautiful, purportedly pristine landscape, with something that is quite glorious on the East Coast, the fall colors of the oaks changing. So you have these dots of red against the greens and that very powerful sky up above. Here is, again, and it was scene after scene of things like this, that pristine landscape and our natural wonders and beauties that, no one in Europe could any longer boast. They had used theirs up, so to speak, but look at all of this around us. This is, for Thomas Cole, a manifestation of the beauty of the divine, right? Here is the power of nature and its beauty, which is part and parcel of God. Now, it's not a huge painting, so he tries to set the scale of the painting. I don't know if you can see this, but follow my cursor, with a little Native American standing next to this fall in the middle. It's primarily just to set the scale of the picture and, lets us imagine the majesty of this area. Now, this will be another thing that's curious at the time. Of course, many of these spots, particularly of the Hudson River School painters, are taking place basically right off the eastern seaboard. And so, these are areas that have been heavily trafficked at this time. People have been visiting them for, 20, 30, 40 years sometime. And in this case, just like my example of Snoqualmie Falls, there was already a lodge at the Catterskill Falls for people to go basically vacation and hang out to enjoy the beauty of that nature. But just like probably if you visited Snoqualmie Falls, you don't want a scene of the incursion of man in nature. And so he basically paints it out. It would have been over here where the red of these fall colors is, but he's just taken that out of the equation. Another famous painting by Thomas Cole is this one called the Oxbow of the Hudson River. It's just one of many scenes that he painted of this very famous kind of curve in the river and, frankly, scenes of nature, in which, on the one hand, right up here in the foreground, you see unblemished, pristine, beautiful nature captured with high fidelity. He's painting in oil paints and capturing every little detail there. There's a squall coming in, a storm, which, by the way, is an indication of the sublime, right? This pattern of the weather that still today we can't figure out, which was indicative of some kind of order that God had in the universe that we couldn't apprehend. It's threatening him. So if you look in the foreground here, this is actually Thomas Cole hiding down here with his easel, whereas the rest of his artworks are up here next to this umbrella until that storm passes. He is, again, ensconced in nature. He is surrounded by the beauty and the power of God. Then we look out over this this kind of hill onto the river in the Oxbow, and we see, but from afar, the cultivation of the land that God has given us. It's kind of like when you fly over the United States or anywhere, frankly, and you look down and you can see areas that have not been, turned into pastures or turned into fields or farms, and then you see all of those farms. This is that patchwork of these areas that have been put to use by man. After he had gone to Europe, Thomas Cole came back to the United States, and as I said, he wasn't really very interested in classical styles at all, but he did want to do something pretty ambitious in a number of his works by illustrating stories that were part of the kind of American epics at the time. In other words, he didn't want to only just paint landscape paintings, even though he thought that was very important. He wanted to add something that Grand Manner added into their depictions of landscape, which was some kind of narrative. And so, turning to American literature for subjects, he picked a number of scenes from James Fenimore Cooper's famous Leatherstocking's Tales. The Leatherstocking Tales, for those you don't know, the most famous of these is the one that was made into a movie called The Last of the Mohicans, and that's what we're seeing here. But he also painted scenes from the other Leatherstocking's Tales, the pioneers in the Pilgrims, for instance. So, again, I'm not going to go into all the ins and outs of The Last of the Mohicans. It's a story that takes place during the French and Indian Wars. It's about a whole bunch of intrigue where the Mohicans are helping out the main protagonists in the story, but they're constantly being attacked by the Hurons, including an infamous, nefarious Native American, your perfect demonic demon, Magua. Magua is just out for blood right and left. He's out for revenge for things that have been done to him. Frankly, he's, to me, a kind of an anti-hero in a way, in that, he exacts revenge for things that he has absolute rights to. But in any case, in this story, as it goes back and forth, two of the main characters, Cora and Alice, who are the white women, are constantly plagued with the types of threats that we saw in works of art last week. Threats of rape, threats of marriage to Native Americans that they don't want to be married to. They become kind of pawns in this bigger story. And what we're witnessing here is a gathering of the chief. Magua is trying to talk one of the white women, Alice, into marrying him. It's basically been mandated by the chief of the time that she should marry him or she will be killed. There's a whole bunch of backstory to this, by the way. And instead of doing that, Alice breaks free from Magua and throws herself over the edge of the cliff, following, by the way, a man that she loved, who has previously done the same. So if we look at this, though, painting, you'll notice the big circle of this council being very minimized, and the major, work is being, or the major emphasis is on the landscape painting itself. After all, the landscape, again, is a manifestation of the divine. Here is that pristine landscape, huge mountains that took eons to grow, so to speak, the endless processes of nature, endless expanses of nature. This kind of vastness, this raw power of nature is a manifestation of the divine. He's just, in a way, ennobled it or complicated it by pointing to the story that is set in nature. And frankly, in the Leatherstocking's tales, from which this subject comes, there's tons of pantheistic ideas in there as well. He painted this, as I said, a number of times, and every time he comes back to it, he tries to add a little bit. I don't know if you can see this, but this rock down here above the group looks like it's right on the precipice and like it could fall off. That's his way to instill in us a little bit of anxiety. After all, Cora, who's this tiny little figure, is going to go throw herself off the edge too. I think, as your reading points out, Thomas Cole was never particularly good at drawing the human figure, so he'll oftentimes set those figures very small off into the backdrop. Another version of the same story, right? So beautiful, pristine landscape. Again, this is just another version of The Last of the Mohicans, but in this case, he realized, I think rightly so, that if he shows you the cliff itself, rather than in the previous one where this mountain in the background gets in the way of understanding this as a drop-off, you can instill that anxiety or make people think about what comes next, of Alice throwing herself off of the edge of this cliff. He also painted scenes. I mean, again, this guy is the most popular painter during his age. He's someone that everyone sought out. He's really kind of the founder of the importance of landscape painting at this time. He painted scenes of Daniel Boone. Here you have Daniel Boone sitting at the door of his cabin on the Great Osage Lake in Kentucky from 1826. As I said last time, Daniel Boone is, by this point, he is an icon of the American pioneer in the wilderness. One of the major works of art I want to talk about is actually a series of paintings. That series was known as the Course of Empire. So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at 5 different paintings from this series that were all meant to be seen together. 4 of them are the same size. The Consummation of Empire, when we get to it, I'll alert you to this, is a little bit bigger than the rest. They're painted by a fellow pantheist, a very important early entrepreneur, Luman Reed, who was a big patron of the arts and a big patron of Thomas Cole's work. And what we see in this series is his idea of pantheism working its way out, imagining the unfolding of time over eons and the progress of a civilization. He calls it the Course of Empire. So the progress of this civilization or this empire towards an end that he thinks most empires go towards, but he doesn't want the United States to end up following this path. Or another way to put this is to say, he's read The Rise and the Fall of the Roman Empire, and in that, as with every empire of Western history, what you tend to see is that empire starts off small, of course, just as a civilization. It gets more and more organization, like the Roman Empire. It then militarily goes out to expand its realm. At a certain stage, it oversteps its possibilities of keeping that culture together, and then it's just a big crash, right? He's worried that the United States, even though it's in its infancy, will follow that same pathway. So he gives us this series of paintings as a bit of a cautionary tale. All of the scenes in the paintings you'll see are set roughly in the same area. So if you keep your eye on this hill, if you follow my cursor with the rock on the top, that's what's going to tell you you're basically in the same spot. The first of the paintings is this one called usually The Savage State. And in the savage state of nature in which he corresponds, look at this nature, by the way, dark, blustery, full of wind, passing storms and clouds, uncultivated to the most extent, just kind of pristine landscape. He corresponds that powerful and yet raw nature, something that is quite threatening, maybe full of promise, but quite threatening, kind of like the West, with these Native Americans. They are both savage, aren't they? So you've got to, if you follow my cursor, it's hard to see these things, but the most easily seen is this, clearly looks like a Native American carrying a bow, running into the scene. Other people back here, again, dressed in animal skins. And then, because it's an icon of Native Americans already, even though we know, it's just the Plains Indian that live in the teepees, a series of teepees out here and just the glimmer of a cleared ground. So civilization starting to unfold. Again, savage nature, let's say it's this, it's forbidding, but it's full of promise. It's powerful, lots of energy in this scene, but it's not very inviting, not very welcoming. It's something that's got promise, but it needs to be harnessed, he wants to say. The second state is what is known as the pastoral state, or course of empire. Pastoral, or Arcadian, it's sometimes called. Both terms refer to a kind of balance or equilibrium of life. So pastoral, by the way, was something that was one of the kind of ways that English gardens were cultivated to be pastoral. In this scene, what we see is the next moment in time of this civilization, this empire. Here's that hill again, so we know we're in the same area, but things have changed quite a bit. It's lightened up, right? There's no storm clouds in the sky. We have still tons of big, beautiful nature. After all, nature is a manifestation of the divine. And remember what that means. God is all around you. And as Ralph Waldo Emerson said, he is helping to control us, to give us a moral compass, to make sure that we're ensconced in his cradle so that he can take care of us. I mean, that's what people at this time believed. So you still have a ton of that pristine nature, but you also see that we're starting to harness that power. A bridge has been built. A field has been cleared to create a pasture and, one believes, farmlands. People are starting to draw on the ground here, so arts are just starting to emerge. We even have, of course, flocks of sheep and a temple that has been built. Now, that temple looks suspiciously like Stonehenge, or a reconstruction of Stonehenge, because, of course, this is a man who was born in England, and believe it or not, the English really thought that Stonehenge was older than every other monument on earth. So he has kind of built that as his temple. He's also probably chosen Stonehenge because, after all, it's made out of stone, it's open air, it's, at this time, by the way, it was associated with Druid culture, so he's thinking it's a culture of religious thinkers that were beholden to the natural processes of the universe and so forth. This is the stage that Thomas Cole, being a pantheist or an associationalist, wants us to place our bets on. This is what he thinks we as an early empire should aspire to. We should aspire to a situation, and we certainly had it under our as a possibility at this time, of a balance between nature and nature read as God and civilization. Inevitably, though, what happens is that these empires keep growing. They don't think very clearly about what they want to achieve. They go for success and growth above all things, forgetting, as Thomas Cole would have reminded us, of the things that really matter in life, the things that give our life meaning. And so in the consummation of empire, which you see here, what we witness is the next stage. Again, the mountain's over here, so we're still in the same place. But now civilization has progressed to such a degree that we have beautiful architectural edifices, we have giant sculptures, we have beautiful boats, lots and lots of buildings around here. This, by the way, painting is about time and a half the size of the two paintings you've seen previously. He really emphasizes this. Now I can go into all the reasons he probably painted it like this. He loved architecture. He wanted to show off his ability to represent that. He's in competition with some of those grand manner painters and so forth. But I'm just going to keep focusing on the meaning of this. If we stop and we think this, that nature is God, and that by being in pristine nature, we are surrounded by the presence of God that is a moralizing force in our lives, where is nature now? And the answer is, it's hardly to be found anywhere, is it? Nature has been replaced by by man's own monuments to his own grandeur. One of the buildings here is a big church, right? And the building over here is a governmental building. Now, even early on in the United States, the idea for all Federalists, didn't matter who you were or which party, of big government or big church, these were no-nos. No one wanted this. We also see in the foreground, and your text goes into or alludes to this, you see an emperor riding along with his retinue of people on an elephant. How do we feel about totalitarian leaders at this time? Well, most people find them repulsive because, after all, that's the reason we left Europe in the first place, to get away from those kings and queens and elites. There is probably a veiled reference to Andrew Jackson here as well, who was a populist and ruled by basically pleasing the masses with, by othering Indians in particular, but also by promising to, overthrow the elites and not listen to anyone's rules and, just pandered to populist beliefs. And there may be a reference to him. So there's much more to this, and you can kind of wander your way around this and see all of this opulence and all of this, what on the surface would look like success. Isn't this what America wanted to progress towards? But then there are little things that say, no, we don't. The big church, the big government, empires always come with totalitarian rulers, and there are little minor warnings. If you look up here in the fountain and you got up close on this, you'll see kids playing with boats. And those kids, actually, let me just get us in here a little bit. These kids playing with boats here, they're already fighting. The older boy has sunk the younger boy's boat. So you're to know, and it's right in the foreground, this is a little bit of a foreshadowing that something is going to go wrong now that we no longer have our moral compass. Just wanted to show you some of these details. This is a symbol of victory. That's Athena, who holds in her hand a winged figure. So that's Athena, symbolic of victory here. It's a little nod to the classical tradition and classical mythology that, of course, he was competing with. So on to the next scene. In the next scene, again, we're in the same area. Notice the hill. You see the destruction of empire. And now what's occurred? Well, inevitably, Thomas Cole wants us to think, once we've lost sight of God, once God is no longer, holding us in his cradle and we're no longer ensconced in nature, we're going to lose our moral compass. We're no longer going to be protected. And that's exactly what's happened here. We don't know who they are, but untold hordes of barbarians have come in and destroyed this beautiful city and laid waste to its populace, raping and pillaging along the way. The major symbol here is the headless hero. Headless, right? A reference to the idea that we're not being guided by the reason of God any longer, which has led us to this fate. And then you see again, he sets the tone for this destructive scene with this really dark, foreboding, powerful storm of nature pushing through this city scene. There's a close-up of that. The final scene in this series, The Course of Empire, is called The Desolation of Empire. And in this scene, I said before that ruins are a way that an artist, particularly romantic artists, point towards the sublime and point towards the idea of endless cycles of nature, point towards time as having a magnitude that is so far beyond our possibility of human mentation that it has to point to that idea of the sublime, right? Billions of years, what does that even mean? And in this case, that destroyed nature, we're still in the same spot, right? There's our hill. The destroyed city is being basically taken over by nature again. The stones that went into the buildings are returning to the earth. Ivy grows over those stones. Nature is starting to reassert itself. And this is a big idea, of course, for pantheists as well, that nature's processes are cyclical and they unfold like empires do, but over a much, much longer time, over and over again. This is something that people could still believe at this time, which is not so much in evidence today, which is, doesn't matter what you do to nature, right? Eventually, your empire is going to die and nature will reassert itself as it has historically over and over again. In our world, where we have pushed, the use of natural resources to the extreme, massive global climate change and so forth, it's not quite clear that nature is going to just kind of recorrect itself after we're gone. So it's a big cautionary tale, right? And it's one of his more ambitious series. He did paint a whole host of series of paintings. His other most famous one is this. This is called The Voyage of Life. It's a standard subject, by the way, in paintings, in which you use metaphors to talk about what life's all about and what its different stages are. And I'm going to take you through this rather quickly because I just wanted you to see this. Basically now we have 4 different paintings in the series. They're all the same size. And again, they're on the different stages of life. He is a pantheist, and so every time you see nature, you're seeing a presence of God. In this scene, the starting point, childhood, you see a guardian angel in a boat or a canoe with a figurehead that's also a guardian angel and a little baby in that boat. And in this scene, you can see we're coming out of a cave. The cave is a big symbol or allegory for Mother Earth being the birthplace of all life. And by extension, because God is Earth, God is the starting point for all life. At the beginning, everything is wide open. Beautiful, beautiful landscape. Everything's growing. Everything's young. Everything's pristine. Keep your eye on this canoe and the figurehead. Right now, it looks like it was just freshly minted out of the factory, ready to go. The child's little. You can't see where you're going, though, when you're a child, can you? You just are excited to be going somewhere. In the next scene, notice how he's changed our vantage point. Now we can see where we're going. And the child has grown into a young man. This stage is youth. And in youth, you have big aspirations. He's talking basically about people that are roughly your age. You got a general idea of where you're going. You have big dreams. You've set your guardian angel on the shore. You don't need that chaperone, your parents, anymore. And you're setting out towards that dream. In this case, it's a huge architectural, onion-domed type of site. It's just about, aspiration. Then, of course, you get to manhood. That's this scene. And let's say in life, things don't always go as planned, right? Life's going to throw some obstacles in your way. Now you're all alone. You've set your guardian angel off to the side. But your guardian angel, and he wants you to know this, is still watching you from above. This is a manifestation of God, again, in nature, in this case, in the power of this incredible storm. The canoe is heading towards a rapids, right? Looks pretty difficult. And what do you do when you're heading towards a rapids? Well, honestly, you should grab an oar. But what he's doing is praying to God to see him through, because after all, this is a metaphorical rapids. He is going to keep centered on his faith. Oh, by the way, I should have said this. You can't see this here, but if you see this in real life, I'm going to get us in close to see if you can see this. There are these demons. Oh, I guess you can see it here. There are these demons that exist in the clouds themselves that are trying to push him away from his belief in God. They're things like despair and hatred and so forth. In the final scene of the Voyage of Life, called Old Age, you see man at the end of life. Now look at the canoe. It's beaten and battered. There's not even a figurehead on it anymore. He's lived his good life. He's made it through the pitfalls of life. He's maintained his faith in God, and the everlasting life awaits him. The guardian angel has returned. You see another angel beckoning to him, and he will be delivered to the grace of God, right? That's, again, the grace of God being the endless sky, heaven, the light of the earth, all these metaphors that we've been using so far in this class. So I'm going to pause here. That's the part one of the landscape painting lecture. When we come back, we will move our way through a number of other painters, all of whom are pantheists, but not all of whom are giving us cautionary tales about progress in the way that Thomas Cole did.